So hello there. My name's Todd Powers, and I help out with the Morning Oaks group. And I'm pleased to come and talk with you about shame and self-pity. That's our lesson for today. So, do you recognize this video, this figure? It's straight from Dr. Bruce's Plumline video last week. It shows how the pendulum of our lives swings from rejection to rebellion and back and forth again. And that's what I'd like to speak with you about today. I'd like to tell you a story about rejection and rebellion. And the story I'm going to tell you has a lot of shame, self-pity, and hopelessness on the rejection side, and a bunch of drugs and sex and alcoholism on the rebellion side. And right here in the middle, where the big circle is where I spent 45 years. Now, even though I'm in the middle of this story, it's not really a story about me. I'm not the protagonist in the story. The story is really about a villain. It's about the big lie, the liar, the untruth teller, the person who, the one who twists reality and twists our lives. It's about the evil one. If you met me for the first time today, you'd probably think I live a pretty good life. And I do. I mean, I'm definitely not missing any meals. But when I walked into Vineyard Church 7-8 years ago, I was not this person. I was a drunken, drug-abusing, loudmouth, angry, foul-mouthed, pot-smoking, unhappy, mean old grandpa is who I was. And of course, I didn't come to the church because I needed a church. I came because my daughter thought it would be a good idea to put the kids into a church environment. So I agreed to come and bring them to church. But on that first session, I heard the pastor say that Vineyard Church isn't a church, it's a hospital for broken people. And that hit me hard because I knew even then that I was a broken person. And then in that same service, there was an introductory video for a group called Celebrate Recovery. And my daughter very politely suggested that it might be a good idea for me to check out that group. And I did. And Celebrate Recovery helped me get temporarily sober, break free from some alcohol addictions. And once I got a little sobriety, I really needed to get a handle on what made me drink, what was the stuff that was underlying this chaos that was in my head. And that's what brought me into this group, into Oaks of Righteousness. So when I came into Oaks of Righteousness, I was really seeking the answers to those questions, like you are today. Little background history. I was the fourth of 4 kids, so I was maybe a little spoiled, maybe spoiled rotten, some people would say. I had 2 older sisters and an older brother, and I was raised in a good Baptist home, so very strict, very faithful, in the church all the time. And it was a good home. Life was good. When I was almost 10, my mother got pregnant with a little baby girl. And so she had that child, and that girl's name was Kimmy, my little sister. She had beautiful red hair and blue eyes, and she was a sweetheart. But when she was about a month or so old, we started noticing that anytime you touched her, she bruised. And we discovered that she had leukemia. And in those days, childhood leukemia wasn't as curable as it is today. It's treatable like 99% recovery now, but it wasn't then. And so we lost that little girl. We lost my baby sister when she was 11 months old, when I was 11. And if Kimmy being born messed up my life, which it did, her dying really took a toll on the family. I mean, when she was born, I was no longer the apple of my mother's eye and the focus and center of attention. And having been a spoiled little brat for 10 years, all of that was taken from me. But when she got sick and passed away, everything exploded in the house. My two older sisters, one went to college, one went to move with her boyfriend. My brother had just turned 16, so he had a car and a job and a girlfriend, and he was gone. And my mother basically lost her mind in that misery of losing that child. And when she did recover, she was forced to go to work to help pay off the doctor's bills and the hospital bills, and she was gone. My dad took a second job, and he was gone. And suddenly I went from this spoiled little brat kid surrounded by people who cared about me and paid attention to me to this adolescent latchkey kid with a broken heart, a big hole in my heart where I'd lost my sister and my older sisters and my brother and my mom and dad. I was alone. And that's where the big lie comes in. Because I believed that was about me. I believed I was alone because I wasn't any good. I wasn't worth loving on. I wasn't wanted. I wasn't cared about. Now I know that's a lie now because I've had the opportunity to work through it in Oaks and look at it in hindsight. But at the time, it was a devastating thing for me. I was abandoned as a child with a huge hole in my heart. And so I did what any kid would do, I think. I went seeking love. I went looking for something to fill that big hole. It's a classic example of the lust trap. The pain of being alone swings into a desire for pleasure and goes back into pain and back into pleasure. It's the lust trap, but it's at a very young age, but still. Now around the corner, a block or so, was a kid named Tommy. He was a cool kid. He was 14 and I was like almost 12. So the fact that he paid any attention to me at all was way cool. He had a place in his house up in the attic where his parents never went. And in that place, he had, all the cool stuff that cool kids had. He had usually some beer or something, some weed, some magazines, all that stuff that I knew I wasn't supposed to be involved with. But boys will be boys. And so I learned in that period that there's pleasure in alcohol and pleasure in drugs and pleasure in sex. So like I said, it's a big lust trap that Dr. Bruce talks about. You take the pain that's in your heart and you replace it with pleasurable things, but they don't last. So you hurt and you replace again with pleasurable things. And this is how the big lie works. This is how Satan uses that. He takes a small event and he twists it and turns it into something that changes your life. So this white cloth represents our lives. And it's white because it represents purity. From inception to death, God's design in his perfect world is that we would live a life of purity through the cross. But unfortunately, we don't live in God's perfect world anymore. We live in Satan's world where he likes to twist the truth and twist reality. So what happens in my case was Satan used the big lie. And the big lie was I was unwanted, I was abandoned, I was unlovable, and no one wanted me. No one wanted to be around me. So Satan takes what could have been, what should have been just a tragedy in an adolescent's life, and he turns it into a big lie. And the big lie then is twisted and becomes a part of that person, a part of me in this case. And so what could have been a passing encounter with a teenage kid named Tommy became a lifestyle It became drugs and alcohol. And I'm going to just use these little strings to demonstrate that. Here's my first drink. Here's my first joint. Sexual encounters, what have you. All the sins of a teenager. And what happens there is, if we had lived in a perfect world again, we would have had a full-time pastor or a child psychologist who would have counseled us and would have been able to remove these strings and say, see, that's not reality, Todd. That's a lie. But we don't live in that world either. We live in this one where Satan takes the truth and he twists it. And so I began to believe those lies. And I began to believe that the sex and the drugs and the rock and roll all were a part of who I was. And I ended up, as an adult, living that life, bound up in the guilt and the shame and the self-pity, broken. So let's talk a little bit about shame and self-pity and hopelessness and how we get redemption from those things. Okay, your study guide says that guilt occurs when we break God's law, and shame is what's experienced when we aren't living up to man's laws and expectations. So the dictionary says that guilt is a fact. It's the fact of having committed a specific offense. But shame is a feeling and an emotion. All guilt and shame come from our beliefs, our feelings, our emotions. Shame comes from the untrue blocks that Dr. Bruce talks about, like being unlovable, unworthy, unteachable, a failure, a liar, a cheater. And these beliefs can spiral downward into shame, then into self-pity and helplessness, and ultimately into self-rejection, self-hatred, and even suicide. So I believe there are three different types of shame. There are three different causes of shame. The first is caused by wrongs that we have inflicted upon others. Let's say we have been the cause of a death, or we have lied to someone and hurt them badly. We can become ashamed of those things. So we can have shame based on that. If we abused physically, emotionally, or what have you, we can carry the shame of that sin. So that's one type, wrong that we have inflicted upon others. We can also carry shame from wrongs that have been inflicted upon us. As an example, if you were a child and you were abused sexually, you often carry the weight and the burden of that sin on yourself. And we lie and think that we're responsible for that. And that is shame that is based on wrongs inflicted upon us. So that's the second type of shame. And the third type of shame is self-inflicted. This is shame that you bring upon yourself. This is knowing that I gamble too much. There's no real explanation for why I gamble too much, but I do, and I'm ashamed of it. Or I drink too much, or whatever that is that we can be ashamed of. It's self-inflicted. It's not caused from any outside source. So there's wrongs inflicted upon us, wrongs that we have inflicted upon others, and self-inflicted shame. Now, self-pity often comes from that shame or from rejection. It can also be caused by abuse, by physical, sexual, or psychological abuse. Self-pity can be generated out of if-onlys. And the if-onlys are things like, if only I had a better job, or if only my wife hadn't cheated on me, or if only I had, been my brother, or what have you. Those if-onlys are also lies of the devil. So what are the causes of self-pity? Well, shame can lead to self-pity. And self-pity can also be caused by rejection. It can be caused by abuse, whether that's physical, sexual, or psychological or emotional abuse. It can be caused by the if onlys in the world. And by if onlys, I mean, if only I had a better job, if only my wife hadn't cheated on me, if only whatever the devil can give you to lie about that would change your life. Because those are not truths, those are falsehoods. Can also be, you can also feel self-pity as a result of believing that you're being punished by God, or punished by your spouse, or punished by whomever. It's like a woe is me sort of thing. Words spoken over you can cause self-pity. You'll never amount to anything. You're worthless. You're trash. You're nothing but a drunk. You'll always be like your dad. Whatever those might be, those are called curses, and spoken over you, they can lead to self-pity. As can vows, things that we say to ourselves, like, I'll never be successful, or I'll never be like my father. Any of those things can lead to self-pity. You know you're in a state of self-pity when you begin to involve other strangers in your own drama. You've all met the lady in the check stand who wants to tell you her whole life. There's something going on there that's not healthy. So as we deal with this guilt and shame and self-pity, the results are just what you would expect them to be. We build walls around ourselves, just like Dr. Bruce talks about. We have relationship problems. We have trust issues. We have personal value issues. And ultimately, these things oppress us. They oppress our spirit. And they break off our communication with God and work, as the devil wants them to separate us from God and from his authority. So how do we get out from under the pain of shame, self-pity, helplessness, these sorts of things? Well, have you ever felt, first of all, we know biblically that through the blood of Christ Jesus, we're forgiven and that we're redeemed. But perhaps you feel like I did, redeemed or forgiven, but not fully redeemed, not free of that burden, not released from the shame, not free of the self-pity, not relieved of the pain and the helplessness. Well, redemption from shame is a process, and that's what we want to be sure we understand leaving this class. Redemption from shame is a process, and it begins with forgiveness. Well, actually, it begins with discernment. It begins with recognizing that these are lies. It begins with looking back and asking God to help you discern what are the lies that you are believing at this time. And then it proceeds to confession. Once we've identified the lies, in my case, the big lie, that I wasn't loved, then I had to confess that I believed that lie and ask God's forgiveness for it. So then it moves into forgiveness. I asked God's forgiveness. I had to forgive my mother for abandoning me, even though there were legitimate causes for that. I had to forgive my father for abandoning me. I even had to forgive my sisters, my sister who went to college and my other sister who left home in a totally normal fashion. I had to forgive them. I even had to forgive my baby sister, Kimmy, for having the nerve to die on me. I know it sounds crazy, but I had carried a burden of blame for her, and I had to have forgiveness for her. And the important thing about forgiveness is that you have to choose forgiveness. It can't be, I need to forgive this person, and I know I need to forgive this person. It has to be, I choose to forgive this person for what happened to me. Without that choice from your own free will, it's not true forgiveness. And forgiveness is the key to redemption from shame and self-pity. You have to forgive others, you have to ask God's forgiveness, and often we have to forgive ourselves. Often we have to forgive ourselves for believing these lies or for acting out in certain ways or what have you. Then, once we have forgiven the person who has harmed us, it's often necessary to relinquish that person. Now, what does that mean? Relinquishment is giving it up. Relinquishment is letting it go. So, once you have forgiven a person, if you're still holding a grudge, or if you're still holding that person, you're still trying to judge that person, you still have some commitment of them in your spirit, then there is a true need to relinquish that person and give them to God. You are not their judge. God is. I am not the person who's going to wreak vengeance. That's not my role. I need to give that to the Lord and relieve myself from it. We need to sometimes relinquish certain rights we have. We may believe that we have a right to be successful or a right to be married. All kinds of things that we can believe that we have a right to have a perfect family, a right to have a father who's present or who loves us, or in all sorts of things that aren't truly always going to be available in this world. They'd be nice, but they're not rights that we have. And so we often have to relinquish rights and give those to God and just recognize that we have to live in the truth of the now and the present. So forgiveness and relinquishment. We often have to relinquish things, events, and then finally, when we've gone through those couple of steps, discernment, confession, forgiveness, and relinquishment, then it is a great place, to offer blessings. If you can bring yourself to forgive the person and relinquish the person who's hurt you, and then go to God and ask that they be blessed, that's real forgiveness. And that's very freeing. And when you can then praise God for that and offer thanksgiving, you will find your spirit in a different place once you've worked through that. So that is the process of moving into redemption from shame and self-pity. So once you move through those steps, discernment, confession, forgiveness, and relinquishment, this is a great time to offer blessings. If you can get to the place where you can forgive the person who harmed you and ask God the Father to bless them, you will find a freedom of spirit that is incredible. When we are able to move away from the desire to punish or what have you, into blessing and praise and thanksgiving, then we know that we have moved past the anger and the hurt. And angry and hurt, that's the man that I was when I walked into Oaks of Righteousness. I was all twisted up, all torn up in Satan's lies. I had a lot of work to do. I told you already, I even had to forgive my baby sister. I had to forgive that kid Tommy. I had to forgive my sisters. I had to take a hard look at my marriage and many of the things that I had done. I had to dig rocks. We're very selfish, humans are. I was a very selfish person. So I had to forgive myself. I was all bound up in self-pity and shame, and I had to ask God for forgiveness, and I had to forgive myself. But we know that there's freedom. There's freedom in the cross. So despite the fact that I was all bound up in Satan's lies, if we just let the work of the cross work, the weight of the cross can take us into freedom. And we can just pray away these issues. The big lie is nothing but a lie of Satan. And when we recognize that, we can go back to the freedom of living in the Spirit and in purity. So that's what we're here. And what we're here for is how to get back to living in the freedom of the Spirit. I encourage you to go dig deep. Go dig those rocks. Plow the field. Find those lies. Find the roots of these issues. Find the guilt and the shame and the self-pity, the curses and lies that Satan has used, and give them all to God. Turn them over in ministry next week so that you can experience the joy and the freedom of living in the Spirit. Thanks.